The United States has been the world's dominant power since the Second World War, but today there are new economic challengers: Brazil, Russia, India, and especially China. Does a faltering U.S. economy compromise its role as the world's only superpower? Next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
We've heard it before, dire forecasts of America's loss of world stature. In the 1970s, it was defeat in Vietnam and the decline of the dollar. In the 1980s, it was Reaganomics and the rise of Japan. In the 1990s, the collapse of the world order following the end of the Cold War. Today, new economic players are vying for influence on the global stage. Brazil, Russia, India, and China, to be exact, with countries like South Africa and Turkey not far behind.
We know that these 6, 8, 9 countries count as the major powers, the rising powers that are going to shape the world of the 21st century.
20 years ago, their economies represented a fraction of the world's industrial wealth. But analysts predict that 20 years from now, these countries will be dominant forces in the global marketplace. Brazil was once best known for lawlessness and inflation. Now it is energy self-sufficient, one of the world's foremost producers of alternative fuels, and a powerful voice in global trade talks.
If you talk to companies, it's all of a sudden the most interesting place for companies to invest.
Russia, flush with oil money, is reviving an anti-American tack not seen since the 1980s. Ignoring U.S. protests, Russia invaded Georgia. Repeating its stance during the Cold War, Russia is befriending Iran and Syria, trying to block the expansion of NATO. India has the world's fastest expanding workforce. Once supplying the workforce for call centers outsourced by U.S. companies, new Indian graduates are now competing with the American firms that once employed them. America's most formidable opponent today is China. Not long ago, it was a stagnant Maoist state. Now, China is the world's fastest growing economy, and its economic heft comes with considerable political strength. China defies international conventions on currency, copyrights, Darfur, and Tibet.
What you're going to see in the 21st century is a return to the norm where China and India always had and will now continue to have the world's largest economies.
Will these new economic challengers keep growing, or might they burn out? Do they aspire to superpower status? How will they use it, and how will the U.S. respond? Rising Giants, the world's fastest growing countries, coming up next on Great Decisions.
And now from our studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Joining me to discuss the world's rising powers are Parag Khanna, Senior Research Fellow at the New America Foundation and author of the book The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, and John Wolfe, President of the Eisenhower Fellowships and a former U.S. diplomat in several countries, as well as a former top State Department official on Asian affairs and non-proliferation. Thanks to both of you for being with us on Great Decisions. When we talk about rising powers, let's have a kind of definition. What do we mean by that? What are the characteristics of a nation that is a rising power? Parag?
The rising powers or emerging powers in the world are not only becoming substantial forces and drivers in their own regions, in other words, even organizing the regional institutions around themselves, but they're also starting to reach out and conduct global diplomacy in all directions. Turkey has good relations with Europe, with Russia, with the Arab world as well, even with Israel now. Kazakhstan has strong relations with China, with Russia, with the U.S. Brazil is building direct diplomatic and trade relationships with China and India and Africa. So you see these are the rising powers because they're controlling and starting to set the agenda in their own neighborhoods, and they're also conducting global diplomacy very confidently.
John, your view on this?
I mean, those are right. There are different countries are rising powers in terms of different aspects. India has always been a very effective force with diplomacy. Brazil is increasingly like that. South Africa like that. I think none of the ones one would name, Russia or China, India, Brazil, South Africa, none of them are truly world powers in the way that most people have defined the United States in terms of our ability to project force, to project our values, our culture for better or worse, our system sometimes for better or worse. We have problems, but the whole world is affected by things that happen in the United States. These others do it in different aspects. They're all growing economically, and they are increasingly important factors, but whether they are the power yet, China would be the one in the economic sphere, which is a world power.
Great Decision spoke to some other experts about this as well. Let's hear who's on their list.
In the Western Industrial Revolution, when you saw an improvement in living standards in one lifetime, you saw an improvement of about 50%. In Asia, you're seeing an improvement in standards in one lifetime, not of 50%, not 100%, not 200%, but 10,000%. Now, this is the fastest ever economic growth seen in history, and it's happening in Asia.
When I think about Brazil today, it is Brazil's moment in time. It has changed quite dramatically since President Lula became the president 6 years ago. He is a labor leader who has come in and implemented a macroeconomic model, a very conservative macroeconomic model that put a great deal of emphasis on a sound fiscal approach. He reduced inflation quite dramatically, and he has created through his policies a boom in the country.
The world has been closely following Turkey's recent success, especially our great economic performance in the past 5 to 6 years. Our revenue has reached nearly $1 trillion, and we became the 15th largest consumer economy in the world.
All right, so President Gül was last, so what do you think of Turkey? Is that a reasonable claim for him to make? Parag?
Absolutely. Turkey is a fascinating example. Because of its geographic position, it's not actually reliant on Europe in order to be a great power. And that's the misconception that a lot of us have in the West. We look at Turkey and we believe that their sense of self-worth and that their world role hinges on acceptance eventually into the European Union. That's not actually the case. The relationship that Turkey has had with the EU in the last 40 years has been that European investment and support for Turkish stability and growth has led to a situation which I today call neo-Ottomanism. You have a Turkey that sees itself as a regional power that can have relations with, in all directions, good relations with Russia, with Iran, with Syria, with Iraq, and all over, and including with Europe. But it sees itself very independently, and that's not the way we tend to think of it. So I think the president is absolutely right that Turkey is very much a confident rising power.
A military power in any way?
It's a sizable military regional power.
It has a sizable army and a growing economy. I spent a lot of time in Turkey working on the Baku-Ceyhan oil pipeline and working with the president of Turkey and the countries to the east. But it's a regional power. It's growing. It's a very important cornerstone country, important facing east and important facing west. I wouldn't put it in the same category as a China or a Brazil.
Parag, I don't think Americans think of Brazil as a world power, really. They think of it as a large nation, but not as a world power. Is that a mistake on the part of the United States?
What's important is to see Brazil the way Brazilians see Brazil, and they see themselves as the America of South America, not as a subservient junior partner in the hemisphere, but they certainly aspire to be an equal with America. That may or may not ever happen. The point is that we have to respect their ambitions and understand that sensitivity when we deal with them, especially today as Brazilian confidence is growing in its political and economic elites and its global trade diplomacy, where they've had a very huge impact on the WTO and in other areas. So I think we have to, with or without nuclear weapons, really respect Brazil a whole lot more than we have.
Would you characterize India as a world power at this point?
I would term it as a large and growing power. It's certainly the strongest by far in its region, but a world power, not by the definition that I started with, which is both the ability to project force and to project influence all around the world, and to gain the respect of everybody for who they are and what they stand for.
Parag, you want to comment on that? Is India a world power?
I completely agree with John. There's a lot of overestimation going on as to India's present reach and its potential reach. It has massive structural liabilities. There's enormous geographic constraints. A lot of people just say China, India, even Chindia, as if they were the same. Or an equally big mistake is to say, well, here's a country of 1 billion people and here's a country of 1 billion plus people. They're both in a neck-and-neck race. But China borders 14 other countries, has a 50 million strong diaspora, has a very coherent regime. India is a sprawling, messy democracy with very little consistency in its foreign policy and is surrounded by water and by the tallest mountains in the world, and a smaller diaspora and less sense of its role in the world. So its power projection capability is more limited, its ambitions are more limited, and it's very far behind China in the grand scheme of things.
Now that takes us to another area I want to cover. Each of these countries we've talked about, and some others we haven't, project their power in a certain way. And some of them, as we've discussed, do it militarily. Some of them do it in other ways. India projects its power in terms of its potential consumer power and in terms of its energy influence and climate change influence. India could influence the United States in a very strong way in terms of the climate in the future based on its decisions on use of energy. How do these countries project their power in the world? They do it differently. Parag, you want to?
They all do it very differently. India is capitalizing on the globalization age. It's using its technological know-how to be one of the world's main software production centers, and it provides some very sizable percentage of the software or is part of the production chain of a lot of software that's used in the United States. So it has become a very important technological center. It uses its diaspora to build influence. It has, trade representatives and partners all over the world. It is certainly active in energy diplomacy, exploring oil and gas exploration in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and Africa. Those are the ways in which, those are the foundations on which Indian influence will be built in the 21st century. And of course, it is very different from the 20th century. It is not a military exercise the way one would traditionally think of great powers rising. And in that, it's an admirable goal.
Some of our great decisions experts, other experts, also commented on the non-military ways in which many of these world powers or growing powers express their power. Let's listen to what they have to say.
I think one of the miscalculations that the Bush administration made was that they predicated their national security policy and their approach to the world affairs on the premise that the United States could be the predominant power in the world, and that we would brook no peer competitors. That simply is not a sustainable approach given the new power dynamics that are at play in the world today.
Brazil, unlike, frankly, even the United States, has pursued a 20-year energy strategy. Brazil, an emerging economy, a BRIC, being so advanced in this space, frankly, I think is a role model for many other countries to follow. In terms of the creation of alternative energy sources. They've also taken a leadership role in Haiti. They're working in some African countries to reduce malaria together.
When it is necessary, our army and police forces play an important role to protect peace. From Afghanistan to Kosovo, from Bosnia to several countries in Africa. All these actions draw the attention of the world.
John, you spent a lot of time in Asia working with Asian countries. I want to ask you about China's projection of power. It's got a huge military, but it, for the most part, has not projected that military force outside its own borders. We had the spacewalk in 2008. Do you think China is on the verge of emerging as an externally projecting military power?
Their history doesn't suggest that. The only projection externally that we would probably talk about right now is the situation across the strait in Taiwan, and there the election of a new president in 2008 has opened up the possibility of a dialogue that perhaps could reduce tensions.
And of course the Chinese don't consider that external.
And the Chinese don't consider that external. They have a running border dispute with India, and when we talked about India, we ought not to forget that it does have nuclear weapons, and it has engaged in active warfare with two of its neighbors. One might, the Sri Lankans might sometimes think that it was three of its neighbors. So it uses military power. Military power is something you have to think about there, but that's kind of an older concept. I wouldn't think about China as a threat, for instance, as we look at it, not a threat to the United States, and really not a threat as a global power.
Not a threat to the rest of the Pacific?
It will have influence because it is so large and so involved, and over the last decade or more, they have built their ties economically. They're building a navy. They have a massive armed forces that are increasing the expenditures. It's still a very small in our terms, but it's big. It is the dominant power in Asia, and it's a major player on the world scene.
We haven't even mentioned Russia so far, and clearly Russia is a world power of one sort or other. It's a superpower also. It still has its nuclear weapons. Russia's actually been using its military power more recently. They invaded Georgia in 2008, for example. Is that something the United States and other countries will have to be on the alert for? Is Russia using its military power in some way?
The U.S. has actually, for at least the past decade, been aware of Russian military activity around its region. The smaller interventions that it's done in Central Asia, obviously there was the Chechnya War, which we all watched very closely, and then Georgia in 2008. And then there's always been smaller altercations, such as a cyber attack against Estonia and so forth. So the U.S. and Europeans have been watching Russian activity and subterfuge, if you will, around Eurasia very carefully in the last few years. And they're going to continue to for so long as the government is riding high oil prices and is feeling very insecure about its borders and its reputation in the region.
Russia doesn't have a particular economic strength except in the sense of its energy exports. That's a big factor, though, and they can influence other countries that way as well, can't they?
Whatever oil prices are, the Europeans have created a situation in which they are highly dependent on energy sources that come either from Russia or through the Russian pipeline systems to them. That's going to give them perhaps a disproportionate influence, even if you leave aside their vast military force or their vast nuclear force, which is not the biggest threat in terms of the actual usage. I would say that a Russia with as many nuclear warheads as it has is dangerous just in terms of if one of them gets loose and it moves to a non-state actor. But Russia has leverage, and they've created the situation so that they can use the leverage on their immediate neighbors and potentially in Europe.
I want to ask you about a couple of smaller countries that we haven't mentioned either, but I think some people put in the category of emerging powers or world powers in one way or another. South Africa, Parag, for example. What about South Africa? Is it a world power? Would you characterize it that way? A growing one?
I mean, to be brutally frank about it, it's not even close. I mean, there's a lot of sympathy in the West and elsewhere for South Africa, its potential, for sure, as Africa's economic leader and even a moral leader as it has been under Nelson Mandela. But a lot of that edifice has been crumbling and the potential has been unrealized. As you know, of course, Thabo Mbeki was forced to step down last year. And so in a variety of ways, it has, again, I'm using a strong word, but it has failed the expectations that a lot of people have had for it as a leader in Africa.
They're effective in global fora. I guess we should have said when we were talking about India or Brazil. They are very effective when it comes to international organizations in which power is not tilted towards, for instance, the developed countries. And they're very effective diplomats, but they're a regional power and they have massive internal problems that they need to deal with before even to keep themselves as the dominant regional power.
And speaking of regional powers, I just want to ask you about this one. It doesn't come up on many people's lists. Would you consider Israel to be a world power? It's in the news everywhere in the world all the time. It's clearly a regional power. It's got nuclear weapons. It's got a strong economy, tiny population. Where does Israel fit in the panoply of the countries we've been discussing?
Well, they certainly have the ability to be a catalyst for world-shaping events. And they are certainly a power in their region, and they have, as you say, a small but very important economic power. If they could find with the Palestinians and Arabs around them a way to settle the Israeli-Palestinian war, dispute. They could create a peaceful situation there, and I think Israel could be a very powerful force for good in the Middle East.
Parag, do you want to comment on that at all?
I agree that it could be. However, there's still this broiling internal debate there and elsewhere as to whether Israel is the eastern front of Western civilization or whether it needs to realize that geography is destiny and find an accommodation with its neighbors. I think that right now the tension between those two remains, unfortunately, unresolved.
All right. Now, I want to come back to a point both of you made earlier in our program, which is that many of these developing powers, these emerging powers in the world, have serious problems of one sort or another internally that they have to deal with. Let's listen to what some of our great decisions experts had to say about that.
One of the interesting features of the globalized economy is that we see winners and losers spread out very unevenly.
Yes, there is still a huge disparity between the rich and the poor. Brazil spends about 4% of GDP on education, which is more than India, more than China. So he needs to bring a whole new class level of education to people.
In the 19th century, when the Europeans built steel mills, they could throw out as much smoke in the air as they wanted to and not have to worry about global warming. Now China and India also have to worry about global warming and be part of the solution too. And then, of course, domestically, they have problems of inequality that are rising. And in the case of China, of course, you have the concern about how will they reform their political system. I mean, I think they'll succeed in doing it, but that's a challenge that they face. I mean, so the Asian states have not arrived yet. They still have many, many more challenges that they face.
Let's talk a little bit about that rich-poor gap or the inequalities, because it seems to me that that's a challenge that stretches across many of these countries. You could say that's true in Russia. You could say it's true in China, in India, perhaps in Brazil and others. How serious a problem is that, preventing these countries, holding them back from truly exercising and projecting their power? Parag?
It's a problem in actually holding these countries together. It happens to be exactly the reason why I titled my book The Second World. The Second World used to mean the socialist former Soviet republics. And now, to me, it means countries that are first world and modernizing and third world and underdeveloped at exactly the same time, and exhibiting all of these tensions and disparities between rich and poor, haves and have-nots, elites, disenfranchised. And I believe that countries like Indonesia and Egypt and Russia, very large, very populous countries, are so internally fragmented, divided, and at potentially, in a state of splintering. And I think that we may see that happen just as much as we're likely to see a success story like Brazil, where everything seems to gradually be coming together.
John, how about poverty and education as issues in these countries?
Well, I think all of those are issues like they are issues for us. The 21st century is going to go to those who have education, who are innovative and able to create new economies. Tom Friedman used a metaphor for China about careening down a superhighway with a large speed bump out there somewhere. And I think in terms of the vast poor and politically deprived of China, that's an issue. He said about India, it's a jalopy that's going on full speed down a very bumpy road to a superhighway in the 21st century. But the question is, will the jalopy hold together till it gets there? I think this is true for many of those countries. There are others where they're doing a better job of closing the income gap.
I was looking at education standards in some of these countries, and I was surprised actually to discover that in most of the countries we've been talking about, literacy is really quite high, actually, in Russia, in India, even in China and so on. So education doesn't seem to be the big problem, or at least literacy anyway doesn't seem to be. Is there a gap in the kind of education, the kind of training these countries offer?
It's not just the raw educational skill. It's that whole social and political environment that encourages innovation, but also encourages risk-taking, doesn't penalize failure. I think in the 21st century, those are factors that go with education, and the people who succeed are going to be people who are well-educated, but encourage risk-taking to be innovative, and then encourage entrepreneurship. And that takes a rule of law and some other things that many of these countries still don't have.
All right. Parag Khanna, Senior Research Fellow at the New America Foundation, author of the book The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, and John Wolfe, President of the Eisenhower Fellowships and a former U.S. diplomat in a number of countries, as well as a former top State Department official. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Great Decisions. We'll see you next time. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.tv. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
Next time on Great Decisions, the Arctic. Its vast frozen ocean, flanked by 8 nations, has long been prized by explorers, traders, Cold War militaries, and prospectors. But the region is changing. As the Arctic ice melts, who has the right to claim the region's precious natural resources? Next time on Great Decisions.